Story number 1. Room 206. The Bates Motel was the last place I'd expected to end up. Nestled off a lonely stretch of highway in Arizona, it was the kind of place you only stopped at because you were desperate, tired, and a little too far from anywhere that mattered. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its letters flickering in and out, giving the entire place an uneasy glow. I had been driving for hours, heading to the Grand Canyon, but the dark desert roads and the monotony of the trip had worn me down. When I spotted the motel sign through the haze of my headlights, I decided it was better to rest for the night than risk an accident. The lobby was sparse, the kind of room you could walk through in 5 steps. A bored-looking man stood behind the desk, his eyes glued to a small TV perched in the corner. When I walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and he barely looked up. "Room?" he asked, his voice flat, as if he'd been asking the same question for decades. "Yes, please. Just one night." He slid a form toward me, his eyes finally meeting mine as I filled it out. "We've got a few rooms open, but not 206. I stopped writing. "Why not 206? "It's out of order," he said quickly, his tone curt. "Plumbing's bad." Something in the way he avoided my gaze made my skin crawl, but I didn't push. "Fine. Whatever you've got." As he handed me the key, I saw the faintest flicker of hesitation in his expression. "Room 204. 2 doors down from 206. If you need anything, I'm here till midnight." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Don't go near that room." The motel room was exactly what I'd expected, small, outdated, and functional. The bedspread was an offensive shade of orange, the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the bathroom had the kind of harsh lighting that made you look like you hadn't slept in years. I dropped my bag on the bed and locked the door behind me. The silence of the place was oppressive, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears and made every small sound echo louder. I unpacked, trying to shake off the unease that had been creeping in since the lobby. But my eyes kept drifting to the window, to the door of room 206. It was just a door, like any other. But something about it felt wrong. The way the light from the buzzing neon sign cast shadows across it, the chipped paint on the numbers, the faint scratch marks on the frame, it all made my stomach twist. The desk clerk's words echoed in my mind, "Don't go near that room." By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. The hallway was colder than it should have been, the air heavy with the scent of damp carpet and something metallic, like rust or blood. My footsteps were soft, tentative, as I approached room 206. The door looked unremarkable up close, but when I reached for the handle, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I knelt, peering through the small gap between the door and the frame. The room beyond was dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw the outline of a bed, the faint shimmer of a mirror on the far wall. It looked empty. Still, I hesitated. Something about the stillness of the room made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, faint, and unmistakable, "Don't sleep." I jerked back, my heart racing, and stumbled into my own room, slamming the door shut behind me. I told myself it was the wind, the desert playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, the weight of the whisper pressing against my chest. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind made me jump. And then, at some point in the early hours of the morning, I saw her. She stood at the foot of my bed, her figure barely illuminated by the weak glow of the neon sign outside. A woman, her hair disheveled, her hospital gown torn and stained. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and urgency. "Don't sleep," she whispered again, her voice trembling. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body felt frozen, pinned by her gaze. She took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the carpet. "He's still here," she said, her voice cracking. "He watches. He waits. Don't let him in." And then, she was gone. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the motel. But when I stepped outside, my resolve faltered. The door to room 206 was open. I shouldn't have gone inside. Every instinct told me to turn around, to leave and never look back. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. The bed was unmade, the sheets stained with dark, rust-colored blotches. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something sickly sweet. On the wall, scrawled in uneven, jagged letters, were the words, "Don't sleep. He'll come for you." And then I heard the door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember much of what happened next. There was a voice, low and gravelly, whispering my name. The shadows in the room seemed to move, stretching toward me, suffocating me. And in the mirror above the dresser, I saw him, a figure tall and gaunt, his face obscured, his hands covered in blood. I woke up in my car, parked by the side of the highway, the motel a distant speck in the rearview mirror. I don't know how I got there, but I didn't care. I drove until the sun rose, until the weight of the night lifted. I never went back to the Bates Motel. I don't even know if it's still there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whisper, "Don't sleep." And in the corners of my vision, I see her, the woman, her eyes wide with terror, her warning unheeded. If you ever find yourself on that lonely stretch of highway, and you see the neon glow of the Bates Motel, drive past. Don't stop. Don't check in. And whatever you do, don't stay in room 206. Because once you hear the whisper, it never leaves you. And if you fall asleep, he'll come for you, too. Story number 2. The Echoes Beneath. Mammoth Cave had always been shrouded in mystery. The largest cave system in the world, it stretched for miles beneath the surface of Kentucky, its dark passages and caverns holding centuries of secrets. People came from all over to explore its depths, drawn by its vastness, its history, and the whispers of legends too strange to believe. But I wasn't here for the caves. I was here for the Mammoth Inn. The Mammoth Inn was a boutique hotel perched on the edge of the park, a charming blend of rustic and modern, its wood-paneled walls and stone fireplaces inviting weary travelers. Its real draw, though, was its promise of a unique subterranean experience. The inn was partially built into the hillside, its lower floors merging seamlessly with the upper reaches of the cave system. Rooms advertised the tranquility of nature and the mysteries of the underground, and despite the hefty price tag, the place was always booked. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the hills. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and pine. Inside, the inn was cozy, its lobby warm and inviting, the kind of place where you could imagine curling up with a book by the fire. The staff was friendly but reserved, their smiles a little too tight, their eyes darting toward the floor whenever they thought I wasn't looking. I checked into room 5, one of the lower-level suites. "You're lucky," the clerk said as she handed me the key. "That room's right above one of the oldest parts of the cave. People say they can feel the history there." She hesitated, her smile faltering. "If you hear anything unusual, it's probably just the cave settling. The acoustics are tricky." I nodded, taking the key. Her tone had an edge to it, like she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. But I shrugged it off. I'd heard the legends, how Mammoth Cave was rumored to hold the remains of ancient burials, how explorers claimed to hear whispers in the dark, but they were just stories. Weren't they? The room was beautiful, all polished wood and soft lighting, with a large window overlooking the forest. But what really stood out was the floor. The hardwood was interrupted by a large section of reinforced glass, offering a view straight down into the cave below. The inn's signature feature. Beneath the glass, the cavern yawned, its walls slick and dark, stalagmites rising like jagged teeth from the ground. It was breathtaking and unsettling all at once. I spent the evening exploring the inn, dining in its rustic restaurant, and chatting with a few other guests. Most were tourists, here for the caves or the novelty of the inn itself. A couple from Cincinnati mentioned hearing strange noises at night, but they laughed it off as part of the experience. "Adds to the charm," the husband said with a grin. By the time I returned to my room, the hallways were quiet, the faint hum of the inn's heating system the only sound. I got ready for bed, the glass floor glowing faintly in the dim light, the cavern below a pool of shadows. I turned off the lights, pulling the covers up, and let the stillness of the place lull me to sleep. I woke to the sound of knocking. It was faint, rhythmic, like someone tapping on a distant door. I sat up, disoriented, the room bathed in faint moonlight streaming through the window. The sound wasn't coming from the door, though. It was coming from below. I leaned over the edge of the bed, peering down through the glass floor. The cavern below was still, the shadows unmoving. But the knocking continued, louder now, echoing up from the depths. My breath fogged the glass as I pressed my face closer, trying to see the source of the noise. And then the whispers started. They were soft, barely audible, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the cave settling, but as I listened, the whispers grew clearer. Words formed, fragmented and distorted, voices overlapping in a cacophony of pleas and accusations. "Help us! They're coming! Don't leave us here!" A chill ran down my spine as I scrambled away from the glass, my heart pounding. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, like the groan of stone shifting under pressure. The room felt colder, the air heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, and swept the beam across the room. Nothing. Just the bed, the dresser, the glass floor, and the cavern below. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. The noises, the whispers, it was easy to blame them on exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But when I passed the front desk on my way out to explore the caves, the clerk gave me a strange look. "How was your night?" she asked, her voice cautious. "It was fine," I lied. Her eyes flicked to my hands, and I realized I was gripping the edge of the counter too tightly. "Did you hear anything unusual?" she pressed. "No," I said quickly, stepping back. Her expression tightened, but she didn't push further. The day passed uneventfully. The caves were as magnificent as advertised, their vast chambers and twisting passages a marvel of nature. But I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me, the memory of the whispers gnawing at the edges of my mind. That night, the knocking returned. It was louder this time, more insistent, and it wasn't alone. Faint scratches joined the rhythm, the sound of nails on stone, climbing up from the depths. The whispers were clearer now, their words cutting through the darkness like knives. "They buried us. We're still here. Help us." And then, as I stared down into the cavern, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, sliding along the jagged rocks below. But then it grew, taking shape, a figure, thin and twisted, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It crawled across the cavern floor, its head snapping upward, as if sensing me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was blank, a void of blackness that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps, as more shadows emerged, crawling, climbing, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. The glass floor creaked beneath me, the sound sharp and cracking, and I realized with a sickening dread that the barrier between me and them was thinning. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air burning my lungs. The inn stood silent behind me, its warm glow a mockery of the terror I had just fled. I climbed into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and drove until the inn was just a memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Mammoth Inn. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the stress and isolation had played tricks on my mind. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it again, the knocking, the whispers, the echoes of something that should have stayed buried. If you ever find yourself near Mammoth Cave and you see the sign for the Mammoth Inn, keep driving. Don't stop. Because the things beneath the earth aren't content to stay there forever. And once they know you've heard them, they'll never stop calling you back. Story number 3. Shadows on Route 66. The motel on Route 66 was the last stop we wanted to make. It wasn't the kind of place that appeared in travel brochures or 5-star reviews online. Nestled between a rundown gas station and a barren stretch of desert, it looked like it had been forgotten by time. But the sun was setting, and the thought of another hour on the road was unbearable. "Just for the night," Sarah said, her tone more reassuring for herself than for me. I nodded, pulling the car into the gravel lot. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its red letters spelling out vacancy with a flickering C. The man behind the counter barely looked up as we checked in. He slid an old-fashioned key across the desk, muttered room 7, and went back to reading his newspaper. There was something off about him, the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine, but I didn't think much of it. We were tired, and all I cared about was a bed and a shower. The room was functional. A double bed with a sagging mattress, a TV that probably hadn't worked in decades, and wallpaper peeling in the corners. The only thing that looked new was the air conditioning unit humming loudly in the window. It wasn't much, but it would do. After a quick shower and some takeout from a diner we'd passed earlier, we settled in for the night. Sarah flipped through a battered magazine she'd found in the nightstand, and I stared at my phone, scrolling through news and pretending not to notice the faint hum of unease that seemed to settle over the room. It started around midnight. The first sound was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on gravel. I sat up, listening. Sarah looked up from her magazine, her brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, moving to the window. The curtains were heavy and moth-eaten, and as I pulled them back, I expected to see an empty parking lot, maybe a stray animal or a passing car. But there were people out there. Figures moved through the darkness, their shapes barely visible under the flickering light of the neon sign. They were slow, deliberate, their movements unnatural. My stomach tightened as I watched one of them stop and turn toward our window. It was a woman, or at least, it had been. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, her body twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. "Who's out there?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I whispered, letting the curtain fall back into place. "Stay here." I stepped outside, the cold desert air biting at my skin. The parking lot was empty, the figures gone, the only sound the faint hum of the neon sign. My breath fogged in the air as I looked around, my heart pounding. Nothing. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me. When I went back inside, Sarah was standing by the window, her face pale. "Look," she said, pointing. I followed her gaze. The figures were back, moving through the lot, their forms more distinct now. But something was wrong, horribly wrong. Their movements mirrored ours. When Sarah stepped closer to the window, so did one of the figures. When I leaned forward, another figure did the same. And then I saw their faces. It was us. Our faces, distorted and bloody, staring back at us through the glass. Sarah gasped, stepping back, and her double did the same, its expression frozen in a twisted scream. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and opened the camera, desperate to capture what was happening. But when I looked at the screen, the parking lot was empty. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the room, the curtains drawn tight. Neither of us spoke, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down like a physical force. Every so often, I'd hear a faint tap on the window, like fingernails against glass, but I didn't dare look. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, we grabbed our bags and ran. The man at the counter was gone, the lobby empty. We left the key on the desk and bolted for the car. The road stretched out before us, endless and barren, but I didn't care. I just wanted to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. Sarah was silent, staring out the window, her hands trembling in her lap. And then she screamed. In the rearview mirror, I saw them. The figures from the night before, standing in the middle of the road. They didn't move, didn't chase us, just stood there, watching. I pressed the accelerator, the car speeding down the highway, but no matter how far we drove, the image of their faces burned in my mind. That was weeks ago. We haven't talked about it since. But something has changed. Sarah wakes up screaming in the middle of the night, her dreams filled with shadows and whispers. And I see them everywhere. Reflected in windows, in mirrors, in the corners of my vision. Our doubles, bloodied and broken, waiting. I don't know what happened at that motel. I don't know if it was the place, the road, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing, we left a part of ourselves there. Or maybe we brought something back. If you're ever traveling Route 66 and you see a rundown motel with a flickering neon sign, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because once you see the shadows, they never let you go. And one day, you might look in the mirror and realize it's not you looking back. Story number 4. The Host's Room. When I pulled into the driveway of the Blackthorn Inn, the sky was already dark, and the flickering light from the old wrought iron sign made me second-guess my decision. Nestled in the heart of Salem, Massachusetts, the inn was supposed to be a quaint historical attraction, capitalizing on the town's infamous witch trial history. The online reviews called it charmingly eerie, perfect for those seeking a thrill. After driving for hours and feeling the October chill seep into my bones, I decided one night wouldn't hurt. How wrong I was. The lobby was a relic of a bygone era. Wooden beams stretched across the low ceiling, and the scent of burning sage hung thick in the air. Behind the desk stood the innkeeper, a wiry man with thin, graying hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His name tag read Malcolm. "Welcome to the Blackthorn," he said, his voice soft and raspy. "You're just in time. We're nearly full tonight." The way he said it gave me pause. The parking lot outside had been nearly empty, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. "Lucky me," I said, trying to sound lighthearted. He handed me a key attached to a small wooden charm carved into the shape of a pentagram. "Room 6, he said, his hand lingering just a moment too long as he passed it to me. "Enjoy your stay." The room was small but cozy, with creaky wooden floors and a four-poster bed draped in deep crimson curtains. The walls were lined with antique paintings, moody landscapes, stern portraits, and one peculiar scene of a group of women standing in a circle, their hands clasped. The room gave me the creeps, but I chalked it up to the atmosphere. After all, that's what I was paying for, right? The first sign something was off came around midnight. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it was the branches of the old oak tree outside brushing against the window. But when I pulled back the curtains, the tree was still. The sound was coming from inside the room. My stomach tightened as I scanned the corners, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching across the floor. I shook it off, blaming my nerves and the hotel's ambience, and eventually drifted to sleep. I woke to the sound of footsteps. They weren't in the hallway or outside, they were in my room. My heart pounded as I sat up, the room cloaked in darkness except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, just the steady rhythm of footsteps, pacing back and forth. My fingers fumbled for the lamp on the bedside table, and when the light flickered on, the room was empty. That's when I noticed a mirror. It was an old, full-length mirror propped against the wall, its frame ornate with carvings of twisted vines and strange symbols. I could have sworn it hadn't been there when I first checked in. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, but something was wrong. The room behind me looked different. The shadows seemed deeper, the angles sharper, and there, in the corner, was a figure. A man, gaunt and gray, his face hidden in shadow. He was staring at me through the mirror. I spun around, but the corner was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. I couldn't stay here. Grabbing my bag, I rushed to the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. I yanked and twisted, my panic rising as the door remained stubbornly closed. "Help!" I shouted, pounding on the wood. My cries echoed in the empty hall beyond, but no one came. Then I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a chorus of voices. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, their tones sharp and rhythmic, like a chant. The scratching sound returned, louder now, coming from beneath the bed. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The bed shook, and then the chanting stopped. When I woke, the room was bathed in the pale light of dawn. My head throbbed, and my mouth was dry. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but the scratches on the floorboards and the overturned lamp told me otherwise. Shaking, I grabbed my bag and threw open the door, it was unlocked now, and stumbled into the lobby. But it wasn't the same. The lobby I'd walked into the night before had been dimly lit, cluttered with antiques and dusty bookshelves. Now, it was pristine, the furniture polished and the air free of the sage's heavy scent. Behind the desk stood a young woman, her hair neatly tied back, her smile warm and welcoming. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "Checking out?" "Where's Malcolm?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Her smile faltered. "I'm sorry, who?" "The innkeeper," I insisted, my pulse quickening. "Malcolm. He checked me in last night." She shook her head. "I'm the only one who works here. Maybe you met one of the guests?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I glanced at the mirror behind the desk and froze. The man staring back at me wasn't me. He had my features, my clothes, but his eyes were darker, his expression colder, and his smile, it wasn't mine. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair, and turned to leave. The woman called after me, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally started the engine and sped away, the blackthorn Inn disappeared in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the mist. That should have been the end of it. But as the days passed, I noticed things I couldn't explain. My reflection would linger a moment too long in mirrors. I'd catch glimpses of Malcolm's face in the corners of my vision. And every night, without fail, I'd dream of the Blackthorn Inn, its halls echoing with whispers and footsteps. I started researching the inn, desperate for answers. That's when I found the records. Every few years, the ownership of the inn changed hands, but the previous owner always vanished without a trace. And every name I found in those records had one thing in common: they'd all checked in as guests before taking over the role of innkeeper. I don't know how much time I have left. The whispers are getting louder, the shadows longer. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I don't see myself at all. If you ever find yourself in Salem, and you see the sign for the Blackthorn Inn, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't check in. Because once you do, you might not leave. Or worse, you might leave as someone else entirely. Story number 5. The Neon Mirage. The desert stretches forever in every direction, an ocean of sand and rock under an endless sky. Driving through Nevada at night feels like drifting through a void, the headlights of your truck carving a thin slice of reality out of the darkness. That's where I was when I saw the sign, a neon glow shimmering in the distance like a lighthouse in the emptiness. The sign read Desert View Motel in big, flickering letters, its buzzing hum audible even from the parking lot. I pulled my rig into the gravel lot, the crunch of tires the only sound breaking the eerie silence. The motel itself was an old, one-story structure, its stucco walls cracked and faded. The office was dark, the windows streaked with years of desert grime, but the neon light cast an inviting glow across the lot. I hadn't seen another car or building for hours, and exhaustion weighed heavy on me. A place to rest, even one as sketchy as this, was exactly what I needed. I grabbed my bag, stepped out into the cool desert air, and headed for the office door. Inside, the reception desk was empty. A bell sat on the counter, its brass dulled with age. I rang it, the sound sharp and intrusive in the stillness. No one answered. A guest ledger lay open on the desk, names scrawled in faded ink. The most recent entry caught my eye: Maggie Holt, room 3. It was dated that very day. Odd, I muttered to myself. The place felt abandoned, yet the sign had been lit, and someone had checked in recently. My unease grew, but fatigue won out. I spotted a rack of room keys hanging on the wall behind the desk. After a moment's hesitation, I grabbed the one labeled Room 5. The keys jingled faintly in my hand, their sound swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The hallway leading to the rooms was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The air felt heavy, thick with a faint metallic scent that made my stomach turn. I passed the first 2 rooms, pausing briefly outside Room 3. The door was closed, but faint voices drifted through it, murmurs too quiet to make out. I didn't linger. Something about those voices felt wrong, like hearing your name whispered in an empty house. Room 5 was just as bleak as the rest of the place. The bedspread was threadbare, the carpet stained and matted, and the walls bore the marks of water damage. A single lamp on the nightstand cast a weak glow over the room, its light barely reaching the corners. I dropped my bag onto the bed and sat down, rubbing my temples. Outside, the neon sign buzzed faintly, its red light seeping through the curtains. I tried to relax, but the motel wouldn't let me. The voices started again, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. I checked the hall, but it was empty. I stood there, straining to listen, and realized the sound wasn't just in the hall. It was coming from every room. I crept down the hallway, my steps slow and hesitant. Room 3 was the loudest, the voices behind the door growing clearer as I got closer. A woman's voice, pleading, followed by a man's angry reply. The words were muffled, but the emotion was sharp: fear, desperation, rage. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I could decide what to do, the voices stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, leaving me standing there with my pulse roaring in my ears. I stepped back, turning to retreat to my room, when a door down the hall creaked open. Room 7. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the dim light from the room. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadow. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rasping. My throat tightened. I didn't see anyone at the desk. I just needed a place to stay. He didn't respond, didn't move. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the room and closed the door. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the voices drifting through the walls. They weren't just in room 3 anymore. They were everywhere, whispers, cries, laughter that didn't sound entirely human. The neon light outside pulsed faintly, casting shifting shadows across the room. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and opened the door, stepping into the hallway. It was empty, the air colder than before. The voices were louder now, an overlapping cacophony that seemed to press against my skull. I passed room 3, its door still closed, and approached room 7. The door was ajar, a faint light spilling out into the hall. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty. The furniture was overturned, the walls covered in deep scratches, as if something had clawed at them in desperation. On the bed lay a single, blood-stained sheet. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with the stench of decay. And then I saw them. Figures crowded the corners of the room, their bodies pale and twisted, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. They stared at me, their mouths moving soundlessly, the whispers filling my ears. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my breath frozen in my chest. One of them stepped forward, a woman, her hair matted, her eyes filled with something between sorrow and rage. She raised a hand, pointing at me, her mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. "You're next," she whispered. The lights flickered, and the figures lunged. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was in my truck, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. The motel's neon sign faded in the rearview mirror, its glow swallowed by the desert. I've tried to convince myself it was a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But every night, I hear the whispers again, faint and insistent, no matter where I am. And when I look in the mirror, I see shadows moving behind me, shadows that don't belong. If you ever find yourself driving through the Nevada desert and you see a glowing sign promising rest and comfort, don't stop. Keep driving. Because once you check into the Desert View Motel, you never really leave. Story number 6. The Bloody Key. Key West was supposed to be a paradise. Sun-drenched beaches, turquoise waters, and a laid-back charm that lured tourists from across the world. But as I stood in the dimly lit lobby of a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, paradise felt a million miles away. The air inside was thick with humidity, and the fan above the reception desk did little more than churn the stale air. I was exhausted from the long drive and didn't have the energy to be picky. The motel wasn't listed on any travel site I checked, but it had a vacancy sign and was cheap. The receptionist was an older man with deep-set eyes and a permanent scowl. He barely looked up as I approached, sliding a battered registration book across the counter. "Room 13, he muttered after scribbling my name in the log. He reached under the desk and produced an old brass key, its surface tarnished and streaked with something dark. "Here's your key." I hesitated. "Is that blood?" His gaze snapped to mine, sharp and unsettling. "It's rust," he said flatly. "You want the room or not?" I should have left right then. Something about the way he spoke, the way his hand lingered on the key, sent a shiver down my spine. But the thought of finding another place to stay was unbearable. I nodded, took the key, and made my way to room 13. The room was what you'd expect from a no-name motel, small, dingy, and faintly musty. The bed creaked when I sat on it, and the bedside lamp flickered when I turned it on. I set my bag down and turned the key over in my hand. It was heavier than I expected, its surface cold and slick. When I placed it on the nightstand, I noticed the faintest red smear on my fingertips. I tried to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. It was just a room, just a key. Nothing to worry about. But as I lay down to sleep, the key seemed to draw my attention, as though it were watching me. I forced myself to turn off the light and closed my eyes. That's when the screaming started. At first, I thought it was a nightmare. A guttural, wrenching cry that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I shot upright, my heart hammering, and turned on the lamp. The room was empty, the door locked, the window shut. But the sound persisted, a rising crescendo of anguish that made my skin crawl. My eyes darted to the nightstand. The key was gone. Panic set in as I searched the room, my hands shaking. I found it on the floor by the door, as if it had been trying to escape. When I picked it up, it was warm to the touch, and a fresh trail of red oozed from its edges, dripping onto the carpet. The scream stopped the moment I touched the key. I sat on the bed, clutching it tightly, trying to make sense of what was happening. My rational mind insisted it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even a prank. But something deeper, a primal instinct, told me this was something far worse. The next morning, I went to the front desk. The receptionist was there, his scowl as fixed as ever. I slammed the key onto the counter. "What the hell is this?" I demanded. He didn't react, his gaze fixed on the key. "You can't give it back." "Excuse me?" He looked up, his eyes cold and unblinking. "The key chooses. Once it's yours, it's yours." "That's insane," I snapped, pushing it toward him. "Take it." "I don't want it." He didn't move. "If you lose it, it'll come back. If you throw it away, it'll find you. And if you try to leave without it," he trailed off, his expression hardening. "You don't want to know." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What is this thing?" "It's a lock," he said, his voice low. "And what it holds back doesn't belong out here." Before I could press him further, he turned and walked into the back room, leaving me alone with the cursed object. I spent the rest of the day trying to rid myself of the key. I left it in a trash can outside the motel. It was back in my pocket by the time I reached my room. I threw it into the ocean, watching it sink beneath the waves. When I turned around, it was on my nightstand. Every attempt to get rid of it failed, and each time it returned, the screams grew louder, more insistent. By nightfall, I was desperate. The motel was eerily quiet, the usual hum of passing cars and distant voices absent. I sat on the bed, the key in my hand, and stared at the door. The screaming had stopped hours ago, replaced by something worse, a low, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the locked room across the hall. I don't know what possessed me to go there. Maybe it was the silence, or the oppressive weight of the key in my hand. Maybe it was the voice I thought I heard whispering my name. Whatever it was, I found myself standing outside room 14, the key trembling in my grip. The door was ancient, its surface scarred and splintered. As I slid the key into the lock, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, the air heavy and still. I turned the key, the mechanism groaning as the door creaked open. Inside was darkness. The air was cold, damp, and filled with the metallic tang of blood. I stepped forward, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, and froze. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends frayed and stained. On the floor beneath them was a pool of dried blood, its edges cracked and flaking. The walls were covered in scratches, words carved into the plaster in jagged, desperate strokes. "Keep it locked. Don't let him out." Behind me, the door slammed shut. I don't remember how long I was in there. Hours, maybe days. The whispers surrounded me, rising and falling like a tide, voices pleading, screaming, laughing. The key burned in my hand, its heat searing my skin, but I couldn't let go. The chains rattled, the air filled with the sound of footsteps, and in the shadows, I saw him. Tall, thin, and impossibly dark, his form shifted like smoke. His eyes burned like embers, his mouth twisting into a smile that was all teeth. He reached for me, and the key screamed in my hand. I woke up in my car, parked miles from the motel. The key was gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air was silent. But the scars on my hand remain, and at night, I dream of the chains, the chair, and the figure in the shadows. If you ever find yourself in Key West, avoid the no-name motels. And if someone hands you a key that bleeds, don't take it. No matter how heavy the burden, it's better to leave it locked away. Because if it gets out, it won't stop with you. Story number 7. The call from next door. The Evergreen Inn wasn't the kind of place you'd find on travel blogs or glossy postcards. It was practical, clean enough, and close to downtown Seattle, which made it perfect for someone like me, a businessman who only needed a bed to collapse into after a long day of meetings. I checked in late, weary from a delayed flight and an inbox full of emails I hadn't yet answered. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me my key. "Room 212, he mumbled. His voice was flat, like he'd recited the words 1,000 times. "Enjoy your stay." I nodded, grabbing the keycard and my overnight bag. The hallways were dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew, but I didn't care. All I needed was a few hours of rest before the big presentation in the morning. My room was at the end of the hall, next to 213. I noticed the door to 213 was slightly ajar, the darkness inside spilling into the corridor, but there were no sounds, no signs of life. I closed my door, locked it, and dropped onto the bed. The mattress was firm, the blankets a little scratchy, but it would do. I set an alarm on my phone, kicked off my shoes, and let myself drift off. The phone rang at 2:13 a.m. I jolted awake, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. For a moment, I thought it was my cell phone, but the glowing red numbers on the bedside clock reminded me that this was the motel phone. I groaned, reaching for the receiver, expecting some mix-up at the front desk. "Hello?" My voice was groggy, barely above a whisper. There was no response. Just static, low, crackling, and persistent. I waited, my irritation mounting. "Hello? Who is this?" A faint voice broke through the static, barely audible. It was a woman's voice, soft and trembling, and she said just 2 words, "Get out." The line went dead. I stared at the receiver for a moment, my skin prickling. A wrong number, I told myself. Just some drunk dialing the wrong room. Still, the voice lingered in my mind, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit to fall back asleep. The phone rang again at 3:13 a.m. This time, I didn't hesitate. I snatched the receiver off the hook, my heart pounding. "Who the hell is this?" The static was louder now, almost drowning out the voice. But it was the same, soft, trembling, desperate. "You have to leave," she said, the words stretched and distorted. "He's coming." "Who's coming?" I demanded, but the line went dead again. I slammed the receiver down, the sound echoing in the quiet room. My eyes darted to the door, to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. The air felt heavier now, colder, as if someone were standing just out of sight. I couldn't sleep after that. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the air conditioning, put me on edge. I checked the peephole, half expecting to see someone lurking outside, but the hallway was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At 4:13 a.m., the phone rang again. I didn't answer it this time. My heart raced as it rang and rang, each shrill tone carving into my nerves. Finally, it stopped. But as soon as it did, I heard something else, the faint sound of a woman crying. It was coming from the room next door. I grabbed the keycard from the nightstand and opened the door to the hallway. Room 213 was still ajar, the darkness inside deeper than before. The crying was louder now, unmistakable. I should have gone back to my room, locked the door, and waited for morning. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. "Hello?" I called out, stepping toward the open door. "Is someone in there? Do you need help?" The crying stopped. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air was colder here, each breath visible in the dim light. Summoning what little courage I had, I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was made, the furniture untouched, but the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. On the wall opposite the bed, faint scratches formed words, "Leave now." The phone on the nightstand rang. My stomach dropped as I stared at it, my hands trembling. Slowly, I picked up the receiver. "She knows you're here," the woman's voice said, her tone laced with panic. "Run." The line went dead. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the room. The lights flickered, the shadows in the corners stretching and twisting. And then I saw her. She stood at the foot of the bed, her figure pale and thin, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were wide, empty, and her mouth moved, though no sound came out. The scratches on the wall deepened, fresh lines forming as if by an unseen hand. "He's coming." The lights went out. I stumbled backward, groping for the door, my heart racing. The room was suffocating now, the air thick with whispers and cries. When I finally found the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. Something cold brushed against my neck, and I heard a low, guttural laugh. I woke up in my car, parked in the motel's lot. The sun was rising, its light painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. My room key was gone, and when I looked at the building, the windows of room 213 were boarded up. The clerk from the night before was nowhere to be seen. I drove away without looking back. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was exhaustion, stress, or the motel's eerie history playing tricks on my mind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the phone ringing in my dreams. And in the silence that follows, I hear her voice, trembling and desperate, "Get out." If you ever find yourself at a motel in Seattle and the front desk clerk hands you a key near room 213, don't take it. Don't stay the night. Because once you answer the call, you might not live to tell the tale. Story number 8. The Red Light Motel. Las Vegas is a city that never sleeps, but its outskirts feel like another world entirely. As I drove along the barren stretch of highway, miles from the neon glow of the Strip, the lights of the city faded behind me, swallowed by the desert's endless blackness. My car's fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and the thought of spending the night in the middle of nowhere wasn't appealing. That's when I saw it. The sign was old, its letters cracked and faded, the Red Light Motel. Beneath it, a single red bulb hung in front of the building, glowing faintly in the darkness like a sinister beacon. It was cheap, shabby, the kind of place that looked like it had never been clean. But my options were limited. The gas station next door was closed, and the idea of sleeping in my car wasn't appealing. I pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under my tires, and parked. The lobby was dimly lit, the air inside heavy with the smell of mildew and cigarettes. Behind the desk sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the creaking chair he sat in. His eyes were small, darting, his smile sharp and uncomfortable. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, hesitating. "What's with the red light?" His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, as if I'd stepped too close to an invisible line. "Decoration," he said flatly. "You want the room or not?" I handed him some cash, and he slid a key across the counter. "Room 8. Checkout's at 10. The room was exactly what I expected, small, dirty, and reeking of bleach. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, stained in places I didn't want to think about. The carpet squished under my feet, damp from some unknown source. I dropped my bag on the bed, locking the door behind me. I sat on the edge of the mattress, scrolling through my phone. The glow of the screen was comforting against the oppressive darkness outside. But something felt off. The air seemed heavier here, as if the room were pressing in on me. I chalked it up to exhaustion and lay down, hoping sleep would come quickly. At exactly midnight, the red light outside flickered on. The bulb cast a dim, eerie glow through the thin curtains, painting the walls in crimson. I stared at the ceiling, unease prickling the back of my neck. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room. The carpet, the walls, even the ceiling, it was all wrong. The color was darker now, deeper, almost wet-looking. I leaned closer to the wall, my heart pounding as I saw the faint streaks running down its surface. It wasn't water. It was blood. Panic gripped me as I backed away, my hands trembling. The blood seemed to spread, seeping from the walls, pooling in the corners of the room. I turned toward the door, ready to bolt, but the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. That's when I saw the writing. It was scrawled across the wall above the bed, crude and jagged, as if carved by desperate hands, "Leave before the red light goes out." The room felt alive now, the walls pulsing like a heartbeat, the sound of whispers filling the air. I grabbed my bag, fumbling for the key, but the shadows closed in, darker and heavier. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, frantic, and angry. "Leave," they hissed. "He's coming." The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I twisted the knob or slammed my shoulder against it, it stayed firmly shut. I turned back to the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and froze. There was someone standing in the corner. It was a man, or at least, it had been. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and black, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. His clothes were soaked with blood, dripping onto the floor in thick, sticky pools. He tilted his head, his voice low and guttural. "You shouldn't have stayed." The red light outside flickered again, casting its shadow across the room. It moved unnaturally, its edges jagged, its form stretching and contorting. He stepped closer, and I stumbled back, my legs hitting the bed. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand, pointing to the wall. The writing had changed. Now it read, "The blood is yours." The shadows surged forward, enveloping the room. I screamed, swinging my bag wildly, but it was like fighting smoke. The air grew colder, the whispers deafening. The man's twisted grin widened as he reached for me, his fingers curling around my wrist. His touch was ice, burning and numbing at the same time. And then the light went out. I woke up in my car, parked in the motel lot. The sun was rising, its light chasing away the shadows. The motel looked different now, old, crumbling, abandoned. The red light was gone, the sign faded and unreadable. My bag was in the passenger seat, and my hands were clean. But my clothes were damp, stained with something dark. I drove away as fast as I could, the events of the night replaying in my mind. When I finally stopped at a gas station miles away, I noticed the scratches on my arm, faint but unmistakable. "You'll come back." If you ever find yourself driving through the outskirts of Las Vegas and see a motel with a single red light, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because once the red light goes out, it's too late. Story number 9. The Door That Never Opens. San Francisco's charm doesn't extend to the kind of motels you find on its edges, tucked away in foggy alleys and shadowed by crumbling overpasses. I'd been driving up the coast for hours and hadn't planned to stop, but exhaustion and a persistent rain had other ideas. The Seaview Lodge caught my eye, not for its aesthetics, but because its flickering vacancy sign was the only thing cutting through the gloom. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as I entered, his thinning hair slicked back and a cigarette smoldering in an ashtray beside him. He slid a key across the counter, grunted something about breakfast ending at 9, and went back to reading a dog-eared paperback. The hallway to my room was dimly lit, the kind of lighting that felt more oppressive than welcoming. My room was 205, halfway down the hall, but my attention was immediately drawn to another door, room 207. The door was different from the others, darker wood, a polished brass handle, and an odd keyhole beneath it. A "Do Not Disturb" sign hung on the knob, faded and cracked with age. I dropped my bag off in my room, but curiosity itched at me. Something about 207 seemed wrong. It wasn't just the look of the door, it was the air around it, heavy and charged, like a storm waiting to break. I stepped closer, pressing my ear to the wood. Faintly, I heard the sound of music. It was old-fashioned, a lilting waltz that sounded as if it were being played on a gramophone. It didn't belong here, not in this dingy, lifeless motel. I crouched, peering through the keyhole. What I saw made my breath catch. Inside was a party. Dozens of people in elegant attire swirled around the room, the women in long gowns and the men in sharp suits, all moving in perfect synchrony to the music. The room was opulent, its walls lined with gilded mirrors and chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow. It was surreal, like stepping into another time, another world. But something about it was off. Their movements were too precise, their smiles too wide. And their eyes, when they flicked toward the door, seemed to glow faintly, like embers. I pulled back, my heart pounding. The hallway was silent, the music gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my tired brain playing games with me. But as I walked back to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something behind that door was watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against the window like impatient fingers, and the faint strains of music drifted through the walls. It wasn't possible, my room wasn't next to 207, and the motel was otherwise silent. Yet the melody was unmistakable, pulling me out of bed and into the hallway. The music was louder now, accompanied by muffled laughter and the clink of glasses. My bare feet patted softly on the carpet as I approached 207. The door seemed to hum with energy, the air around it colder than the rest of the hall. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. Locked. That should have been enough to send me back to my room, but the keyhole beckoned me. I knelt again, my eye pressed to the tiny opening. The party was still there, just as lively and strange as before. But now, the faces were sharper, more defined. A man in a dark suit raised a glass, his grin sharp and predatory. A woman in a red dress twirled, her laughter silent but etched into her face like a mask. And then, as if sensing me, one of them turned. His eyes locked onto mine through the keyhole, glowing bright and malevolent. "Join us," he whispered. I stumbled back, my head spinning. The music grew louder, swelling to an unbearable crescendo, and then, silence. The hallway was dark, the door as still and lifeless as the rest of the motel. I hurried back to my room, locking the door and shoving a chair under the handle. Sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I approached the clerk at the front desk, the events of the night still fresh in my mind. "What's in room 207? I asked, trying to sound casual. His reaction wasn't what I expected. His face paled, and his hand froze midway to his cigarette. "You don't want to know," he muttered. "I'm not joking," I pressed. "I saw something in there. Heard something." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Room 207 hasn't been opened in years. The last person to stay there didn't leave." He looked me in the eye, his expression grave. "Some places hold on to things. Memories, people. That room, it's one of them." His words should have been enough to scare me away, but they only fueled my curiosity. That night, I returned to the hallway, determined to find out the truth. This time, I brought a screwdriver, intent on removing the lock. The door seemed to resist me, the wood groaning under my hands, but after what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked. The room was empty. The chandeliers, the gilded mirrors, the music, it was all gone. The walls were bare, the carpet threadbare and stained. The only thing in the room was a small table in the center, and on it, a single object, a mask. It was ornate, its surface covered in gold filigree, but the eyes were hollow, dark, and foreboding. I stepped closer, my breath hitching as I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the mask, the air in the room shifted. The walls seemed to ripple, the floor trembling beneath my feet. Whispers filled the air, overlapping and frantic, and the door slammed shut behind me. The mask grew warm in my hands, and I felt a pull, something dragging me into the center of the room. My vision blurred, the walls dissolving into a swirling sea of light and shadow. The whispers grew louder, deafening, and I realized too late that they weren't words at all, they were screams. When I woke, I was back in my car, parked in the motel lot. The mask was gone, and so was room 207. The hallway was unbroken, the numbers skipping from 206 to 208. I drove away without looking back, the echoes of the music still ringing in my ears. If you ever find yourself at a strange motel in San Francisco and you see a door that doesn't quite belong, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Some doors are locked for a reason, and some parties are better left unattended. Because once you open the door, you might not like what's waiting on the other side. And if they invite you to join them, pray that you have the strength to say no.